I'm Connor, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. This week, we're going to be looking at the 1977 class of movies, looking at a Neil Simon written, Herbert Ross directed, sort of situational drama, but very much a specific genre at the time that we don't see as much today. I'm talking about The Goodbye Girl. So, if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a class of Oscar movies that were nominated for Best Picture, and I take a look at a movie I've never heard of, and I talk about it. I learn about it, sort of the Oscar race of that year, and then I also give my thoughts on it and try to answer sort of maybe why this has been forgotten, why some other movies have been more remembered, because this is supposedly a year where these are the 5 best movies of the year, yet sometimes some of these movies do get forgotten and not enough people talk about them. So I've been having a good time. I started with year 1988, where all the way down to 1977, working backwards. So if you know any sort of movies that you love and have maybe been forgotten that were nominated for Best Picture, comment below in the comments down, let me know, starting from 1976 onwards. Next week should be a fun episode as well, because that's one of my favorite Oscar years. This show is really designed for both Oscar fans to know a little bit more about the history, but also about some people that would want to hear my thoughts about some films that maybe don't get talked about too often, and sort of try to talk about the reason as to why some of these films just don't really get remembered maybe the way they should. So, start with the 5 nominees. One of the first nominees was Star Wars. I obviously was not going to talk about this in one of the biggest movies of all time, but it is interesting to note that because we're doing this format of working backwards, we can see that sort of the beginning of things, and this is really the beginning of what we just covered in the 80s, which is sort of these very much blockbuster based. The 70s was a really interesting decade because they would say it was a lot tour driven. A lot of these American filmmakers were making big budget movies in the studio system that were really sort of daring and ambiguous endings. But now, with the mark of Star Wars, we see a lot of sort of the franchise being born, which we still see very much today. And that's interesting. And then that one actually did not win Best Picture. The Best Picture winner went to Annie Hall. So that's a movie that some people think, I'm sure there's thousands of Star Wars fans that maybe haven't even seen Annie Hall that think Star Wars should have won. But it's not like, previous weeks we had Ordinary People beating out Raging Bull, or Kramer vs. Kramer beating out Apocalypse Now. I actually think this is a bit of a different scenario because I agree that maybe Raging Bull and Apocalypse Now should have beat those movies. But I'm not sure about Annie Hall because they're almost so difficult to compare. Some people, I'm sure, think Star Wars should have won that year, but Annie Hall is still a movie that has stayed in the relevant pop culture. From director Woody Allen, who's been well respected for many years, and is arguably one of his best films. It's a romantic comedy, which is so different than Star Wars. It's almost so hard to compare. But it is worth noting that this one has actually been remembered. This one still plays in theaters. But it will be interesting to see sort of his legacy, I think, in a lot of ways. Because, with sort of the sexual misconduct around Woody Allen, it could be a situation where, we just don't want to recommend his movies as often because of the man behind them, so that he sort of gets forgotten. But history tells us with a guy something like Hitchcock that they will be remembered. Hitchcock was sort of verbally abusive on the sets and manipulative, so maybe not the best guys, but we still talk about his movies today. We try to separate the art from the artist in that respect. But then the next 3 nominees really could have chosen any of them. One of them was Julia. This is from director Fred Zinnemann, who did A Man for All Seasons and From Here to Eternity and The Day of the Jackal. So he's got some notoriety. It was a film that had some interesting stars, but it mostly was written by Alvin Sargent, who I want to take a minute just to give my thoughts and prayers, because he recently passed away. And we recently talked to him. He was also the screenwriter of Ordinary People, for which he won an Oscar for that movie and for this movie. He also wrote the screenplay to, I think, Spider-Man 2, Amazing Spider-Man, and maybe in the first Spider-Man. He was the sole screenwriter on Spider-Man 2. I know that for sure. So he's done some amazing screenwriters. So rest in peace, Alvin Sargent. You will be missed. And then the next 2 nominees, The Goodbye Girl and The Turning Point, are actually nominated by the same director, Herbert Ross, which is really incredible. This is sort of a Steven Soderbergh year, except he was only nominated one time for directing for not The Goodbye Girl, but The Turning Point. And The Turning Point is interesting because it had 11 Oscar nominations but won none, because it didn't win any of the big top prizes. It didn't win any of the technical ones because those all went to Star Wars. So that's an interesting little tidbit. But the Goodbye Girl didn't win an Oscar. It went to Best Actor, Best Lead Actor for Richard Dreyfuss. which was a bit of an upset at the year because Richard Dreyfuss was sort of the ingenue, the sort of up-and-comer, which often doesn't get sort of recognized in the Best Actor category at least. And this was Richard Burton's 7th nominee. But so everyone thought, this was going to be a Glenn Close sort of situation where, yes, he was going to win. He was going to win. It was his 7th nomination. It's just overdue. But still, they went to sort of the up-and-coming Richard Dreyfuss. 2 years ago, he'd done Jaws. The same year, he had Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a much juicier role than Richard Burton's role. I think he's very much more animated in that sense that he plays an actor and sort of is right up the actor's kind of wheelhouse in a lot of ways. So that was disappointing in making Richard Burton sort of tied with Peter O'Toole for being the most losing actor with 7 nominees and no wins. But another reason why I want to talk about The Goodbye Girl is sort of this Neil Simon style. He very much has a certain style similar to Woody Allen, I think, where it's always maybe in New York or in a city. There's always fast talkers. Some of the characters are neurotic. There's incredible dialogue and sort of this certain pace, this sort of romantic, situational kind of comedy drama. That was really the appeal of this movie because Neil Simon, I think, was the appeal. He was just a writer, which is kind of incredible that he was the appeal, but his name was on the poster. This is because he was a playwright, a successful playwright who had adapted many of his films, many of his plays, Sweet Charity, Barefoot in the Park, The Odd Couple, for which a lot of them he actually wrote the screenplays to before that, and then he started doing film-only screenplays, but not directing them. So it's kind of an interesting sort of style because it's very much a Neil Simon movie, even though it's directed by Herbert Ross, who in itself is actually a fascinating director because he got nominated. 2 of his movies, he made 2 movies this year that both got nominated for Best Picture, which is incredibly hard in a class of 5. So he was really hot this year. And then, he has a really interesting career. In '84, he makes Footloose. Steel Magnolias in '89. He has some very interesting movies. Last of Sheila, 1973 is a good one. So he has a very interesting career, and this is definitely maybe a high point for him, at least in awards recognition. But transitioning into my thoughts, this is a kind of movie that I actually really enjoy. This is, but maybe not love. There's sort of a certain cap to these kinds of movies. This one was similar to An Unmarried Woman last week. But An Unmarried Woman I thought was a little more emotional because it doesn't adapt this style fully. It's very much a Neil Simon movie in the sense that it's written by a playwright. There's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of fast moving people, they're jumping back and forth. Richard Dreyfuss is very animated, kind of neurotic. So is Marla. She plays Marla in the movie, so there's Marla and Elliot, and then sort of a precocious young girl who's years behind her age, Lucy. And I like the dynamic between the two. I think there's great funny lines. It's very entertaining. You can jump in at any time. But then the problem I always have with these movies is sort of the romance aspect. And when it does work, it does work. It feels believable. But sometimes it just sort of feels tacked on at the end. And unlike something like a Quentin Tarantino movie, where I feel like the point is not just the fast dialogue. Like, that's a style element to it, but there's also some visual style and visual flair. There's also themes that he wants to explore as well. These ones often explore sort of situational, funny situations, situational kind of comedy, some tragedy, living sort of an artistry in a lot of times, but then also that sort of romance aspect. And this one I felt that I wasn't necessarily fully on board on. I really never am bored on these because I'm much more interested in sort of the other half, that when it does turn, I go, okay, this is the part where it turns. Although, really incredible job by the 2 leads. There's a great banter and great back and forth, and they really just eat up the dialogue. And this is a movie that I definitely enjoy. I'm not sure if I was absolutely blown away by it. I loved it. I wasn't sure if it was a great 1977 movie, but maybe that's why, that's the central question. Why hasn't this been remembered? Maybe because 1977, it's always different opinions for different people. Maybe not my personal favorite year. Looking at some of the movies, and some of the big movies of the year weren't necessarily critical darlings. Something like Saturday Night Fever, which did get Travolta an Oscar, lead actor Oscar nomination. But then something like Smokey and the Bandit, and The Goodbye Girl. This is a constant theme coming throughout the weeks, is that The Goodbye Girl is a movie that would never make $100 million like it did back in 1982. 1977. And this is one of the highest grossing movies of the year. So this is in the top 10, which is really incredible. There's so much draw for this kind of movie, which is kind of hard to believe. And it's kind of a recurring theme, sort of the box office of these kind of films. I just think that Marsha Mason, maybe she hasn't been remembered as much the same way Richard Dreyfuss has, but even he hasn't been sort of a Harrison Ford or whatever, despite having a really great 70s. But maybe that's sort of the difference between men and women. We often see sort of women in Hollywood after 60 struggle to get roles, where men, something even like John Wick, for example, with Keanu Reeves, I think he's like 50, or Tom Cruise, they're still doing action movies, so there's still sort of roles for them. So maybe that's just a problem with Hollywood, and that's a problem that these films aren't getting made, and people maybe aren't seeing these kinds of films. So it's kind of a difficult thing to wrestle with. So maybe that's why an actor like Marsha Mason hasn't been remembered as much, and therefore her films haven't been talked about as much. Maybe that's the reason. But I think if you're a fan of someone like Richard Dreyfuss and Close Encounters and Jaws, which really do have held up, you may want to check out some of his other films, and this one maybe one you stumble upon. I think that's its legacy right now. But I think that if you're a Neil Simon fan, this is one that will not disappoint. I think this will satisfy you. I'm not sure if it will blow you away. I think this is definitely one that I can recommend to a lot of people, but maybe not one that I've been loving the past few weeks with all that jazz, Rare People and Unmarried Woman, which I really enjoyed, because Unmarried Woman, for example, really nailed the sort of the older woman kind of aspects to it, and the emotional moments. Maybe because they just sort of allow for reaction shots, so there's not dialogue constant. Like, there is a strength to dialogue, but you can tell this was written by a playwright. It's not incredibly cinematic in a lot of ways. It takes place a lot in one apartment, almost like a film. So, we'll see how, if you do check it out, but do let me know for next week, because next week's going to be a really great year, 1976. I think arguably maybe my favorite year in Oscars history, but there's still one film that I've never seen. That'll be fun to check out next week. That's about it, guys. If you have any more suggestions for future weeks, that'll be a lot of fun. I'm Connor Old, and until next time, stay tuned.